They mocked the quiet nurse as a fraud in front of the whole unit, until one calm answer made a decorated SEAL commander go silent, and the truth she had buried for years began clawing its way back to the surface. If this story moved you, hit like, tell us where in the world you're listening from, and subscribe for more. The forceps in her hand did not shake. Everything else in the supply room did. Major General Frank Halloran stood over her chair, one finger jabbing the air an inch from her face, his voice bouncing off metal shelving stacked with crates and coiled hoses. "You're not a SEAL nurse," he said. "You're not anything. You're a girl in scrubs who got lucky with a rumor." Behind him, 3 Marines laughed, loose and easy, the way men laugh when they know no one will stop them. Reagan Shaw kept her eyes on the surgical tray in front of her, counting instruments she had already counted twice. Navy blue scrubs, sleeves pushed to the elbow, a smear of iodine drying brown on her wrist. She had learned a long time ago that stillness cost nothing, and said everything. Dr. Walter Kessler stood off to the side, arms crossed over his white coat, watching with the tired patience of a man who had seen 100 versions of this scene and never liked any of them. He did not step in. He never did. It was not his fight, and everyone in the room knew it. Near the back, half hidden by a rack of oxygen regulators, a lean man in a plain grey t-shirt leaned against the wall, arms folded, laughing along with the others out of habit more than conviction. His name tape read Marsh. No rank showing, no insignia, just a face that had learned to give nothing away. "Word going around base is you served," Halloran said. "Special operations, some kind of ghost unit." He smiled without warmth. "You know what I think? I think you let a rumor grow, because it makes you feel important, makes the other nurses treat you different." Reagan set the forceps down with a small, precise click. "I never said I served, sir," she said. Her voice was low, even, unhurried. "You did." The laughter behind Halloran stumbled, then died. Marsh's arms came uncrossed, slowly, like a man realizing he had been holding his breath. Halloran's jaw tightened. "Careful." "I am being careful," Reagan said. "That's the whole problem." For 1 second, nobody moved. The overhead lights buzzed. A crate hissed somewhere in the stacks, a slow leak of compressed gas nobody was paying attention to yet. Halloran straightened, recovering his authority the way men like him always did, loud and fast. "Get back to your tray, nurse," he said, and turned to leave, waving the Marines after him. Marsh did not move right away. He looked at Reagan a beat too long, something working behind his eyes, and then he followed the others out. Kessler exhaled. "You didn't have to poke him." "I didn't poke him," Reagan said. "I answered him." "With him, that's the same thing." She almost smiled. Almost. This was Naval Support Facility Cordell, a training annex tucked behind the main base, home to the Aerospace Physiology Unit, a low, unglamorous building where pilots and operators learned what their bodies did at altitude, in vacuum, in the thin edges of human tolerance. Reagan had taken the civilian contract nurse position 11 months ago. Quiet work, predictable hours, a room full of altitude chambers, oxygen rigs, and men who assumed a woman holding a clipboard had never held anything heavier. She liked it that way. She needed it that way. The room smelled like rubber seals and machine oil. And underneath that, faint and metallic, something else. Reagan's head came up. "Dr. Kessler," she said, "do you smell that?" He sniffed, shrugged. "Old tanks. This whole wing needs a maintenance pass." "That's not old tanks." Reagan was already moving toward the regulator rack, eyes scanning gauges the way she used to scan a cockpit instrument panel. Fast automatic, looking for the one number that did not belong. One of the training chamber's supply valves sat cracked open, just enough. A hairline stress fracture ran along a fitting that should have been replaced years ago. Pressure was bleeding out in a slow, invisible stream, and somewhere down the corridor, a chamber run was already in progress. Her pulse did not spike. It dropped, the way it always had, into the flat, focused calm she had trained a decade to reach. "Get me the chamber log," she said. "Now." Kessler blinked at her tone, the sudden shift from quiet nurse to something with edges. "Reagan, now, Walter," he went. The chamber log told her everything she needed and nothing she wanted. A routine altitude run, simulating 25,000 feet, 3 young airmen inside for a physiology familiarization exercise. Standard protocol, standard oversight. A single technician monitoring gauges that were, at this moment, quietly lying to him. Reagan moved through the corridor at a pace that made 2 Marines flatten against the wall to let her pass. Halloran was already there, arms crossed, watching through the small round window of the chamber door, with the bored expression of a man who had seen 1,000 training runs and expected nothing from this one. "Depressurize," Reagan said, stepping past him without asking permission. The technician, a young petty officer named Cruz, glanced up. "We're not at the depressurization phase yet, ma'am. Sequence has another 6 minutes." "Look at your outflow gauge." He looked. His face went pale. "That's not possible," he said. "It read green 30 seconds ago." "It's not reading anything now," Reagan said. "You've got a fractured fitting bleeding pressure into the supply line. Whatever those three are breathing in there is thinner than what your panel says it is." Halloran uncrossed his arms. "You can read that gauge better than a certified technician?" "Right now, yes," Reagan said. And there was no apology in it. Through the small window, one of the airmen inside the chamber had stopped moving his hands the way pilots were trained to move them during a cognitive check, a slow, deliberate tapping pattern meant to catch early hypoxia before a man even knew he was in trouble. His fingers had gone loose. His head had begun to drift. "He's altered," Reagan said. "Pull him out. Pull all three out, right now." Cruz's hands hovered over the controls, frozen between protocol and panic. "If I abort mid-sequence without clearance from—" "You'll have 3 unconscious men in 90 seconds if you don't," Reagan snapped. "Abort the run. I'll take the responsibility." "You don't have the authority to take responsibility for anything," Halloran said, stepping between her and the console. "This is my facility, my protocol." Reagan met his eyes, and for the first time since she had walked onto this base, something in her posture straightened, some old current running back into her spine. "Sir, with respect, in about 60 seconds, one of those men is going to lose consciousness at altitude, and the other 2 won't be far behind him. I am asking you to let a trained technician follow a normal abort procedure. That's all. Nobody needs your permission to save a life." Something about the way she said it, flat, exact, absolutely certain, cracked something in Halloran's certainty. He did not step aside, but he did not stop her either. Cruz's hand found the abort switch. The chamber's pressure equalization began, a slow hiss climbing to a shriek as the system fought to bring 3 men back to sea level before their brains ran out of oxygen entirely. 30 seconds. The airman who had gone still slumped sideways against the safety harness. 40 seconds. One of the others started slapping weakly at his own restraints, disoriented, panicked in the dull, drowning way hypoxia panics a man, without urgency, without clarity. 50 seconds. The chamber door released with a heavy metallic clunk. Reagan was already moving before the door finished swinging open. "Get him horizontal," she said, catching the slumped airman under the arms as 2 technicians rushed to help. "Legs up, loosen his collar. Talk to him. Tell me his name." "Airman Delgado," Cruz said, voice cracking. "Delgado," Reagan said low and steady, close to his ear. "You're safe. You're on the ground. Breathe with me." His eyes rolled, found her face, lost focus again. Behind her, Halloran had gone quiet, watching a woman he had called a fraud 20 minutes ago move through a medical crisis like she had done it 100 times before, in places far worse than a training annex on a Tuesday afternoon. Marsh had appeared in the doorway at some point, unnoticed, his eyes fixed not on the injured airman but on Reagan's hands, the way she moved them, the exact economical way she checked pulse, pupils, respiration, without a single wasted motion. He had seen hands move like that exactly once before, a long time ago, at an altitude that had nearly killed him. Delgado's breathing stayed shallow, too shallow, his lips taking on a faint blue tint that made the room go quiet in a different way than before. "He's not clearing," Cruz said. "Sats aren't coming up." Reagan's fingers found the pulse at his wrist, counted, frowned. Fast and thin, a heart working too hard against too little oxygen for too long. "He's not just hypoxic anymore," she said. "He's got fluid moving into his lungs. High-altitude pulmonary edema, accelerated by the pressure fluctuation. If we don't get him breathing efficiently in the next few minutes, his oxygen saturation is going to keep dropping no matter how much air we push at him." Kessler crouched beside her, stethoscope already at Delgado's chest. "I'm not hearing clear crackles yet." "You will be in about 90 seconds, Reagan said. "I need positive pressure ventilation, and I need it now, not standard oxygen mask. A cannula isn't going to move fluid out of the way fast enough." "We don't keep that kind of equipment in a training annex," Cruz said, panic sharpening his voice again. "We have basic O2 masks and a first aid kit, that's it." Reagan's eyes swept the shelving, the crates of altitude training gear stacked floor to ceiling, and something in her expression shifted, calculation replacing fear. "Give me that," she said, pointing to a coiled length of tubing on the equipment rack, then a spare full-face demand mask meant for altitude chamber emergency drills, then the small hand-crank pressure pump used to test regulator seals. "That's testing equipment," Cruz said. "It's not medical gear." "It's about to be." Reagan was already assembling the pieces, hands fast and certain, fitting the mask, threading tubing, adjusting a valve with a twist that looked less like guesswork and more like memory. Positive pressure doesn't care what label is on the box. It cares about physics. Halloran had gone still by the wall, watching a woman he had mocked build a functioning positive pressure ventilation rig out of testing equipment in under a minute. "Mask on him," Reagan said. "Walter, hold his jaw forward. Keep the seal tight." She began working the hand pump in slow, measured strokes, timed to Delgado's own labored breathing, pushing air past the fluid gathering in his airways, forcing his lungs to do the job they could not do alone. "Talk me through what you're doing," Kessler said, not doubting her anymore, just trying to keep up. "I'm buying his lungs time to clear," Reagan said. "This isn't a fix, it's a bridge. He needs a hyperbaric transport and a real ICU within the hour, but right now, this is what keeps him breathing until that happens." Delgado's color began to change, the blue at his lips fading by degrees into something closer to pink. His hands, which had been clawing weakly at the mask, went still, then relaxed. "Sats climbing," Cruz said, staring at the monitor like it had performed a miracle. 88, 91, 94. Reagan kept the rhythm steady, eyes on Delgado's chest, counting his breaths against her own pulse, refusing to let herself feel anything yet. Behind her, Marsh had not moved from the doorway. He was staring at the improvised mask in her hands, at the specific, deliberate way she had modified it, a technique he recognized down in his bones, because he had once had a version of that exact mask pressed over his own face at 19,000 feet by a flight surgeon whose name he had never learned and never forgotten. "Ma'am," Cruz said quietly, eyes still on the monitor. "Where did you learn to do that?" Reagan did not look up. "Somewhere far from here." Halloran finally found his voice again, though it came out smaller than before. "That equipment, the way you rigged it, that's not standard nursing training. That's not even standard flight medic training." "No," Reagan agreed. "It isn't." She did not offer anything else. The room held its questions the way it had held its laughter 20 minutes earlier, uncertain now, off balance, waiting to see what kind of woman had been standing quietly among them for 11 months. Delgado went out on a stretcher 20 minutes later, stable, breathing on his own with the improvised mask, still bridging him to a real hospital transport. The other 2 airmen from the chamber run were shaken, but clear-headed, already walking, already asking questions nobody wanted to answer yet. Halloran called Reagan into the facility's cramped administrative office before she had even washed the iodine off her hands. "Sit," he said, though she remained standing. He studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies a puzzle piece that no longer fits the picture he thought he was building. "That rig," he said, "the way you moved, the way you gave Cruz an order and he followed it without thinking twice. I've had combat medics who don't move like that. I did my job, sir." "Don't," Halloran said, sharper now. "Don't stand there and tell me that was just a job. I've watched nurses work crises for 30 years. What I just watched was training, real training. The kind the government spends a great deal of money building into a very small number of people." Reagan said nothing. "So here's what's going to happen," Halloran continued. "I'm going to pull your personnel file, and I'm going to find out exactly who cleared a civilian contractor with your background to work inside a physiology unit that handles classified altitude research. You're welcome to pull whatever file you'd like, sir." "Careful," he said again, though this time it came out uncertain, a man testing ground he no longer trusted. The office door opened without a knock. Marsh stood in the frame, and something in his posture had changed entirely from the man who had been laughing along with the Marines an hour earlier. His shoulders were squared. His voice, when it came, had none of the looseness from before. "General," he said. "A word." Halloran's jaw tightened at the interruption, but something in Marsh's tone made him wave Reagan to stay where she was. "This isn't the time, Commander." "It's exactly the time," Marsh said. He looked at Reagan, and for the first time since he had walked into the supply room laughing, he looked at her directly, fully, like a man finally allowing himself to see something he had spent years refusing to look at too closely. 19,000 feet, he said quietly. A high-altitude training jump gone wrong, 6 years ago, over white sands. My chute deployment triggered early oxygen loss before I even hit ground. I was unresponsive when the recovery team found me. There was a flight surgeon on that exercise who kept me breathing with a hand-rigged positive pressure mask for 11 minutes until a real medevac bird reached us. The office had gone very quiet. I never saw her face clearly, Marsh said. I was half-conscious the whole time, but I remembered her hands, the way she worked that mask. Exact, economical. No wasted motion, like she'd done it 1,000 times before and expected to do it 1,000 times again. He looked at Reagan. I've been trying to place it since the moment you answered the general back in that supply room. And I placed it for certain about 10 minutes ago, watching you do the same thing to save Delgado's life. Halloran looked between them, some old military instinct sharpening behind his eyes. Commander, do you know this woman? No, sir, Marsh said, but I know what she is. Reagan's hands, steady through a hypoxic collapse and an improvised medical rig, were not steady now. Commander Marsh, she said carefully, I don't know what you think you remember. Major Reagan Ellis, Marsh said, and the old name landed in the room like a dropped weight. Flight surgeon, high-altitude physiology program, classified joint operations detachment. You went by a call sign back then. Nobody used your real name in the field. Halloran's mouth opened, then closed. That program was shut down, Marsh said. Officially it never existed, which means officially you never existed either. And yet here you are, in a Navy supply room, letting a general call you a fraud for 11 months without saying a word to correct him. Reagan closed her eyes for one long second. When she opened them, something in her had settled, the way a person settles after finally setting down a weight they have been carrying so long. They forgot it had a name. I go by Shaw now, she said quietly. Reagan Shaw. Ellis belonged to someone I used to be. Halloran sat down slowly, as if his legs had stopped being entirely reliable. Explain, he said. Now. All of it. Reagan let out a breath she had been holding for 11 months. I was a flight surgeon assigned to a classified joint program between the Air Force and a research directorate most people have never heard of, she said. We trained operators for extreme altitude and near-space exposure, decompression events, radiation thresholds, the kind of physiology nobody wants to think about because it usually ends badly. Near space, Halloran repeated. You mean? I mean I trained for spaceflight-adjacent operations, sir. High-altitude research platforms, classified test vehicles, the edges of the atmosphere most pilots never see and most doctors never treat. My job was keeping operators alive in environments the human body was never built for. Marsh had not moved from the doorway. And Delgado today. The mask, the rig. Same physics, Reagan said. Different altitude. A body starved of oxygen doesn't care whether it's in a training chamber or 40 miles up. The response is the response. Halloran shook his head slowly. Why leave a program like that? Why end up here in an equipment room letting men like me talk to you like you were nothing? Reagan's jaw tightened, the first real crack showing in 11 months of careful stillness. Because the program ended the way programs like that always end, she said, quietly, badly. A test flight went wrong. I lost a crew member on the table because the equipment we had wasn't built fast enough to save him, and afterward there was no ceremony, no medal, no acknowledgement that any of it had happened at all. Just a folder that got sealed and a career that got erased along with it. The room was silent except for the low hum of the fluorescent lights. I didn't want to disappear into another cockpit or another classified unit, Reagan said. I wanted to work somewhere quiet, where nobody expected anything from me except competence. A place where if I saved a life, it was just a life saved. Not a headline, not a debrief, not a reason for someone else to decide my next assignment. So you buried Major Ellis, Marsh said quietly, and became a nurse nobody looked at twice. Until today, Reagan said. That worked. Halloran rubbed a hand over his face. The arrogance of an hour ago drained out of him entirely. I stood in that room and called you a fraud. I let my men laugh at you. You didn't know, Reagan said, and there was no cruelty in it, just fact. That's not an excuse, he said. I've spent 30 years in this uniform assuming I could size a person up by the way they carried a clipboard. Today, you proved me an old fool in front of my own unit, and you were right to. A knock interrupted them, sharp and urgent. Cruz leaned into the doorway, face pale again. Sir, ma'am, we've got a problem in the storage wing. That cracked fitting from earlier, it's part of a shared line. Pressure's backing up into 3 more tanks down the rack, and one of them is showing signs of stress along the seam. If it lets go, how much gas? Reagan said, already moving. Enough to take out half that wing if it ruptures fast instead of venting slow, Cruz said. Halloran was on his feet instantly, some of his old command voice returning, but this time aimed at coordination instead of ego. Clear the corridor, get everyone out of the storage wing now. Reagan was already 3 strides ahead of him, Marsh falling into step beside her without being asked, the two of them moving through the facility with the exact wordless coordination of people who had once, in another life, trained to move exactly this way together, even if they had never formally met until today. Talk to me, Marsh said as they reached the storage wing, alarms beginning to whine overhead. What do you need? Someone who isn't afraid of a hissing tank and knows how to read a pressure gauge under pressure, literally, Reagan said. Congratulations, Commander. You just volunteered. The stressed tank sat at the back of the rack, a faint whistling hiss coming from a seam that should never have been allowed to age this long without inspection. If it ruptures fast, it's not just gas, Marsh said, reading the gauge Reagan pointed him toward. It's shrapnel. That casing's rated for slow venting, not a blowout. Then we don't let it blow out. Reagan was already scanning the rack for a manual bleed valve, the kind installed for exactly this scenario, and forgotten about the moment maintenance schedules slipped. There. Isolation valve. 3 tanks down. If we close it before pressure finishes migrating into the cracked line, we cut off the feed and let this one vent slow through the safety relief instead of catastrophically. That valve's rusted half shut, Marsh said, testing it with his hand. Needs more torque than a hand turn. Then we use leverage. Reagan grabbed a length of pipe from a maintenance cot, wedged it against the valve handle, and threw her weight into it, Marsh's hands joining hers a second later, both of them straining against corroded metal while the hiss behind them climbed half a register higher. Faster would be good, Kessler called from the doorway, his voice tight, ushering the last of the technicians back down the corridor. The valve gave with a shriek of protest, turning a 1/4 inch then a half, then finally spinning free under their combined effort. The hiss from the stressed tank dropped immediately, the dangerous edge draining out of the sound as pressure found a slower, safer path to release. Reagan pressed her palm flat against the tank casing, feeling the vibrations settle beneath her hand. It's venting normal now, she said. Threats down. Halloran arrived a moment later, with a maintenance crew, and a look on his face that had nothing left of the man who had pointed a finger in her face that morning. You just prevented what could have been a mass casualty event in my facility, he said, using a background you weren't obligated to reveal, on equipment you had no formal authorization to touch, in a job you took specifically so nobody would ask you to be anything more than a nurse. I didn't do it for credit, General. I know, he said. That's exactly the problem I created for myself an hour ago. Word moved through the base the way it always did, fast and reshaped with every retelling. Until by evening, half the personnel on Cordell knew some version of the story. A nurse who had built a ventilator out of test equipment argued down a 2-star general and closed a failing valve with her bare hands and a length of pipe. Reagan sat alone in the equipment room afterward, the same room where Halloran had pointed his finger at her that morning, running her thumb along the thin scar above her eyebrow, a souvenir from a decompression test that had gone wrong long before Delgado ever walked into a chamber. Marsh found her there, 2 cups of coffee in hand, and set one down without a word. They're already writing a report that's going to have your real name in it, he said. Ellis, not sure. I figured. You could have let today go differently, he said. You could have let Delgado slip, let someone else scramble for equipment, stayed exactly who you've been pretending to be for 11 months. Nobody would have known. I would have known, Reagan said. He nodded slowly like that answer satisfied something in him that had needed satisfying for 6 years. 3 days later, Halloran called her into his office, and for the first time since she had met him, he did not stand. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and this time she sat. I'm putting forward a proposal, he said, sliding a folder across the desk. A dedicated aerospace trauma readiness unit, based here at Cordell, training medical staff across 3 facilities in exactly the kind of improvisation you demonstrated this week. High-altitude injury, decompression events, field modification of standard equipment under crisis conditions. Reagan opened the folder, scanning the proposal, her own service record attached at the back, unsealed for the first time in years. You want me to run it? I want you to build it, Halloran said. From the ground, the way you'd want it built. I spent 30 years assuming a title told me everything I needed to know about a person's worth. You corrected that assumption in under an hour, in front of my whole command. Reagan closed the folder slowly. I'll need Cruz, she said, and I want Marsh assigned as liaison. He's the only one on this base who already knows how to keep pace with me. Halloran almost smiled. Done. Outside the window, the base moved through its ordinary afternoon. Trucks idling, boots crossing gravel. Nobody in that busy, unremarkable world aware that the quiet nurse from the supply room had just been handed a program with her real name back on the door. Reagan Ellis walked out of that office standing straighter than she had in 11 months. Not because a general had apologized, and not because a commander had remembered her hands from a mountain of years ago, but because respect, when it finally came, had come the only way that ever mattered. Earned, not given.